Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for your welcome, everybody, and for your introduction. What I want to do in this session is to tell you something about DNA, what it does, what we can do with it, and what it tells us about ourselves. And I'm going to be asking more questions than giving you answers, and deliberately so, because maybe we can talk through some of these things in the seminars later. Also, you'll see all the attributes and affiliations on the screen. Can I also point out to you Christians in Science, of which I'm a former chairman. If you're a practicing scientist and not a member of that, I want to know why. www.cis.org. Do join that. It's a great association of practicing scientists who are Christians, and there's quite a bit of their free material also on the table. Rodney's given us a wonderful talk already on cosmology. And the cosmologist, when we look at the scriptures, has a rather easy life, because the scriptures look into the heavens and the psalmist sees how wonderful the world is and praises God. And the molecular scientist, unfortunately, can't do that. The scriptures know nothing of DNA, of molecules, of atoms, even of cells. So how are we going to start to address these questions? I want to actually suggest that in the same way that the psalmist could look up at the heavens, if he'd been able to look at things in atomic detail, I suggest that the psalmist would also have looked at some of these remarkable molecular structures and say that they too declare the glory of God. As we look at, and there's various images on the screen there of different DNA molecules, and I'll show you something about a few of those as we go through the talk. DNA itself, I assume that you're coming from a wide variety of backgrounds, both the physical sciences, the biological sciences, maybe no science training at all. But almost everybody has some idea about this molecule I put on the screen. It's almost an icon of our age, that rather beautiful double-stranded DNA with its regular repeating structure. It has been used in all sorts of ways in society. It has nothing to do with DNA at all. And here are some examples on the screen. Obviously in postage stamps celebrating the wonder of that molecule of life, as they call it. You can purchase DNA perfume. It comes in a helical bottle. It is actually a three-stranded helix on the bottle, so they got that wrong. And you can buy DNA perfume for him and DNA perfume for her. It's used as a marketing tool. How, I do not know. So it's something that's sort of instantly recognizable without knowing any detail about what it does. And how often have you heard the phrase, it's in their DNA? Preachers use it. Marketing people use it. Describing the way that companies work. It's in their DNA. Can I just encourage those of you who ever speak publicly never to use that phrase, please? For those of us who work with DNA, and I've worked with it for 30 years in the research laboratory, it's irritating, to put it mildly, but it also rather suggests that we live in a deterministic world. You have no choice because it's in your DNA but to do something. As I take you through this talk, I hope you'll understand that DNA does some wonderful things, but it does not define us. So here's some, and this is from Delix Alexander, provided some of the quotations you can get from newspapers that rather suggest that we are determined. So everything from the love gene to the gangster gene, the mean gene, from genes to hormones, the liberal gene, the gluttony gene, the cigarette smoking gene. You can blame it on your genes. Nothing's your fault at all, is it? Right through to some reader of The Guardian wrote to suggest there is a geneticism gene. A gene for those who think, that predisposes some people to think that their destiny is determined by their genes. And here's a Canadian university encouraging their alumni to give money because building relationships, it's the liberal family tree, it's in their DNA, they can't escape from it, and if you're part of that fraternity, then of course you will want to give money as well, won't you? So whatever else you might take away from this talk, please don't use the phrase, it's in their DNA. Let's look a little bit at the science. It goes back to 1953. If I was to ask you who discovered DNA, you'd all say Watson and Crick, wouldn't you? You'd all be wrong. Because Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA based on Rosalind Franklin's X-ray fiber studies. It was actually discovered by a Swiss biochemist working in the late 19th century called Friedrich Miescher, and Watson and Crick then, over time we realised this was a genetic material. It wasn't just some metabolic artifact. It was responsible for many inherited characteristics. And Watson and Crick solved the structure of that, and then one or other of them is reputed to have said somewhere in the Eagle pub, we have discovered the secret of life. Now, I think I'm passionate about DNA. I've committed a large amount of my life to working with it, but I do hesitate to say there is more to life than just DNA, even for my PhD students, who I hope are working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There is more to life than just DNA, but they have discovered the secret of how life maybe has evolved, certainly how cells replicate and things are passed on from generation to generation. In 2000 we saw the sequencing of the human genome. Many other genomes have been sequenced since, of lots and lots of different organisms. We are the only organism on the planet that has sequenced its own DNA. And when that was first released, the God word was inevitable within that. So it was a Clinton in the White House at that time. Describes that today we're learning the language in which God created life. We're gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. Thus spoke the President of the United States, talking about the wonder of solving that. Francis Collins, director of the Human Genome Project, a practicing evangelical Christian who was overall in charge of that project, described it as humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realise that we've caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God. So the God word comes in at an early stage as we understand some of the fascination of what's been discovered. But how much does it determine the way that we are? I don't know how many of you have explored your family tree and you wonder, not just your facial features, but your characteristics. How much of it is really your fault, or you can blame it on your ancestors? So here we have several male generations of my family, with me and close to the top, left there. And you say, how related am I to each one of those in terms of the way I behave, the way I think? Well, there are some things you can see have evolved over time within this. We have bow ties, neckties, and no ties. That has nothing to do with DNA. We have a series here who all wear spectacles. My son has 20/20 vision. Is that in our genes? The profession, all of those are engineers stroke scientists. They all lived, until very recently, in the West Country, which is why occasionally you can hear a slight Bristolian burr that comes in my voice. And those of you who travel on the train, certainly I see a lot on the adverts as I go from King's Cross to Cambridge. We'll see adverts for this company, 23andMe, where you can send a few cheap cells to them and they'll investigate your genome and tell you what diseases you might be prone to, what your risks for heart disease and cancer and all the rest of those might be by looking at your genome. But how much of us is in that DNA? Here is James Watson. We used to think that our fate was in the stars. Now we know that in large measure it's in our genes. That's a deterministic, fatalistic view of things. Richard Dawkins puts it this way: we are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. That's exactly what we're here for. We are machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It's every living object's sole reason for living. I challenge that. Yes, DNA is involved in propagation. Yes, there is a certain selfishness in the matter that it makes sure that it's copied. But as people of faith, as Christians, I'm sure that we want to say against this every object's sole reason for living. For those who have no children, it says that you failed to pass on your DNA and therefore you've not fulfilled your sole reason for living. That was pointed out to one of the new atheists who has no children. But I wanted in this talk to say a few things about DNA, and so she relate part of it, and maybe this is a bit artificial, to our understanding of God and compare that with DNA. For many people, God is a mystery, in the same way that the molecules of life are a mystery. We just don't understand them. To many people, God is involved in our destiny, controlling the future, what happens. And some will see that DNA is deterministic and controls the way that we behave and we act. And I also want to say that DNA, at least the molecules of life for me, are a matter of wonder and awe and beauty, in the same ways we could look at our Heavenly Father and wonder and awe and worship and praise. But for those who are maybe ignorant of the basic science, let me just fill in a little bit of the gaps. What is DNA? Well, it's the stuff that makes our genes. And a gene itself is a region of DNA where it can be as short as maybe 1,000 of these letters, A, G, C, and T. It can be as long as a few million, depending on the size of the particular gene. And the genes are then arranged together on chromosomes, each chromosome containing maybe a few thousand copies of genes, each of which is going to make a different protein. We have 23 chromosomes, each together make about 20,000 different proteins, far less than we anticipated before we'd sequenced the human genome. Human genome itself is about 3 billion of those letters long. There's 2 copies of it in every cell in your body. So that means you've got 6 billion of these letters in every one of your, or most of your cells. And every cell in your body contains the same DNA. Whether it's a brain cell or a big toe cell or an eye cell, the genetic complement is exactly the same. They're just expressing different bits of it. At least I hope that your big toe is expressing different bits to what's in your central nervous system. It is a remarkable molecule, and these are some rather silly facts from it. If you stretch each of your DNA molecules out, make it linear, it's about 2 meters long in every cell in your body. You've got about 10 to the 13 cells in your body, so if you were to stretch all your DNA end to end, it's about 200 billion kilometers of it in your body, enough to get to the sun and back 500 times, and it's approximately 1% of your total body weight, depending on how much adipose tissue you have as well. What does it do? Well, it's, if you like, the instruction manual for making the proteins, making the constituents of the cell, and the way in which it's metabolized, and the way in which it's controlled. So in this sense, it does absolutely everything. But it also does nothing. DNA itself only does something in the context of the cell in which it's placed. I could put a pot of DNA on the bench in front of you, and it would look like actually a piece of tissue paper that's gone through the washing machine and you forgot to take it out of your clothing before it was dry. It does nothing as long as it just sits there. It's just a rather boring biological polymer. It teaches us some things. The genetic code is constant throughout the whole of biology. So that says that it only evolved once. It says that we have a common nature with the rest of biology. In our genetics, there's nothing that marks us out as inherently special. We, like all the rest of creation, is made from the constituents of matter. We are dust, and to dust we will return. The same genetic code as animals, plants, bacteria, viruses. It reminds us of our humble origins. But people are prone to a kind of genetic reductionism, as I would call it. So genes are us. We're nothing more than just the sum of our genes. We kind of deify DNA. There's something special about that molecule that you daren't do anything with it because it's almost godlike. It's nature in its raw form that we shouldn't tinker with. And the scientists who who manipulate it are playing at God. That's another phrase. Please don't use that, because I don't know any scientists who play. I know plenty of scientists who think that science is great fun, because it is. It's fascinating, but we're not playing. So the phrase playing at God maybe is a misnomer anyway. It subscribes to a kind of fatalism, that we are nothing more than our genes. Richard Dawkins has put it this way: DNA neither cares nor knows, DNA just is. And I'll agree with that part of the statement, but when he goes on, and we dance to its music, then I will start to question quite exactly what he's implying by that. After all, we know as Christians that we're made in the image of God. We need to unpack what we mean by that. 98% of our genome is similar to that of a chimpanzee, but that does not mean that a chimpanzee is 98% made in the image of God. Our identity with God is not dependent on our genome. God is spirit, after all, and those who worship him worship in spirit and in truth. A relationship, in terms of exploring that image of God, is to do with relationships. It's to do with God, who is Trinity, relating to us and us to each other. And that image of God says as much of our moral responsibility to look after the world that he has made as his image within that, and as much as anything to do with our physiology or our anatomy or our genetics. We have learned quite a lot over the sequencing of genomes about ourselves. The whole area of genomics, of comparing the genomes of different organisms. As I've said, we're 98% similar in that regard to chimpanzees. What can we learn as we compare them? And let me give you just a few things that those of you who are geneticists or biochemists will be all too familiar with some of these. Our genomes are full of bits of DNA that we don't know what they do. They're highly repetitive. In the hubris of scientists maybe 10 or more years ago, it was called junk DNA, which means we don't know what we do, so it must be rubbish. That's another phrase. Don't ever use it, because now I think we're beginning to realise we don't know what it does, but it's important, and it's not totally non-functional. These bits have been inserted over evolutionary time in all sorts of places in the genome, and you can compare those insertion points and say, is it there in a chimpanzee? Is it there in a worm? Is it there in a monkey? In say, a banana? And compare, piece together the jigsaw. So when did that insert? And construct evolutionary trees based on this. And when you do that, you find evolutionary trees looked at genomically are virtually identical to those that have been constructed on the basis of gross physiology and anatomy. And in fact, we learn some of the disputes as to which organism fitted in where are actually resolved by looking at the genome cells. Our genomes too are full of what we call pseudogenes. They're redundant bits of DNA that are no longer used, in fact often corrupted. You do know that you're supposed to eat 5 a day, don't you? That's because you need the vitamin C. I'm not quite clear whether 5 apples is rather different to 5 grapes, but never mind. And that's because we can't make vitamin C. We have to ingest it. Plenty of other animals and organisms can make their own vitamin C. And if you look in our genomes, you can find a mutated version of the gene that would originally have made that. Well, obviously we've lived in a vitamin C rich environment, we didn't need to make our own, and that gene has no longer been necessary, so it could mutate without any disadvantage to those living in a fruity environment. You can do the same for smell receptors. You'll be aware that many organisms have far better senses of taste and smell than we do, and when you look in our genomes you find all kinds of mutated, redundant taste and smell receptors that are no longer functional. You can compare chromosome structure. We have 46 chromosomes. Chimpanzees have 48. And when you look at that, the difference here comes in this chromosome 2. We have 1 chromosome 2, they have 2 smaller chromosomes. And when you look at the detailed architecture of that, you can see how our chromosome 2, over evolutionary time, has arisen from the fusion of 2 primitive chromosome 2s. So in the middle of, let me skip a little bit, in the middle of our chromosome 2, you find regions that are normally found at the end of chromosomes. And there's a region in the chromosomes called a centromere that appears in the middle, and you can find almost 2 centromeres in our chromosome 2. So it appears as though over evolutionary time, and that's 6 million years between us and the last common ancestor and us and chimpanzees. Over that time, 2 chromosomes are fused together, so we learn a bit about our evolutionary history. You can look in our genomes too and compare with other hominids. Now, some fascinating studies being able to extract DNA from ancient hominid bones, Neanderthals, for instance, and see how does our genome compare with theirs, and see how much of their DNA might have copied into ours. And you find that something like between 1 and 4% is present in that. There's something of the Neanderthals that lives in us. And maybe again it's our arrogance that we assume that Neanderthals are rather thick and stupid brutes, and we feel ashamed at having Neanderthal DNA in our genomes. It turns out there's more in the European genomes than there is in the African genomes, and certain white supremacists in the US have turned the whole thing upside down and say, well, Neanderthals must have been brilliant and strong and intelligent. So misuse of genetic information. But what is it that makes us human? Are there any genetic changes that make us human? There are very few genes that are specific to humans. There are ways in which genes are controlled and the timing at which they're switched on and the rate at which different proteins are made that is very different. But there's almost nothing that marks us out genetically that this gene or this protein is only found in humans. After all, and these are quotations taken from the journal Science, we're in the age of a genome, but we can still recognise that it takes much more than genes to make the human. We're not just defined by our chemical makeup, but our relationships together. I think it's an African saying that a person becomes a person through persons. It's our relationships together that define us. They actually influence the ways in which our neural networks are laid down. They influence our epigenetics. They influence all sorts of things that come on top of our genomic makeup. So in the same way that DNA does nothing except in the context of a cell, so we are really rather restricted as people, except in the context of relationships with others and with our Heavenly Father. And that's one of the reasons why we meet together regularly as churches, as Christians together, because we're defined not just as individuals, but in our relationships. But can I blame my genes? If you've got here's just some examples. If you've got one of these, then yes, you can blame your genes. Whether it's cystic fibrosis or haemophilia or Huntington's disease. If you have a mutation that produces one of those, then your condition will indeed be caused by your genes. Things go wrong with DNA, whether it's point mutations. A single one of those 3 billion letters goes wrong. And that happens in something like cystic fibrosis. Sometimes bits of one chromosome break off and attach to another one, and it's in the wrong place. And that often happens with a number of cancers. And sometimes bits of the genome get repeated. It's almost as though it stutters in the replication apparatus. A number of diseases like Huntington's disease and some forms of motor neuron disease originate from that stuttering. And if you've got one of those, then yes, you can blame your genes. But we need to ask a bit more about how much can we attribute to our genes. Here's a question: is biology destiny? And it's not taken from a biology journal. That title is taken from the International Socialist Review. Why are the socialists involved in asking questions about biology and destiny? And you see some things even in reputable scientific journals. Here is a quotation taken from an article in Nature a few years back, which I think with hindsight the editor would be ashamed of publishing. An increasing number of studies suggest that biology can exert a significant influence on political beliefs and behaviours. Genes can exert a pull on attitudes concerning topics such as abortion, immigration, the death penalty, and pacifism. It's rather a deterministic view of the world. If you've said that they may have a small influence upon, I would have been satisfied with that. But it's actually gone over the top with that, so that you then end with, It's difficult to change someone's mind about political issues because their reactions are rooted in their physiology. So give up ever trying to change somebody's mind. Give up trying to persuade somebody to change their beliefs, because it's all rooted in your genetic makeup. That is a pile of tosh, I'm sorry. And if you do subscribe to that form of genetic determinism, it's worth thinking of what your attitude to society is. Because that says that the problem with society is the people and their genetic makeup, not the inherent structure of society itself. So there's no point in trying to aim for a better society. If you really do believe in that genetic determinism, you should aim one way or another for eliminating those who are inferior species. So beware of that. It does affect them. But what about other genes for some things? Is there a gene for criminality? If the ladies amongst us would like to put their fingers in their ears for a moment, the answer is yes. There are a series of genes for criminality, and it's called the Y chromosome, which is because well over 90% of the inhabitants of jails across the globe are men. There's a greater correlation with that than almost any other genetic property. But that doesn't mean to say that all men are criminals. Far from it. It's not a determinism. That association of maleness with criminality doesn't necessarily say anything about a causation. It's not the Y chromosome that causes people to be criminals. In fact, about 1 in 1,000 men have an extra copy of the Y chromosome, and the studies now show that they're no more likely to be criminals than the ordinary XY male. Other aspects of our behaviour. I took this from the BBC website, from a programme that they did sometime last year, looking at what they call the resilience gene. There are some people that are more resilient than others, and some cave in over the slightest little problem in life, and others have very resilient characters. And they looked at Simon Weston, who you may remember from the Falklands crisis, who had the terrible injuries. And they took him through the tests for the resilience gene, and I don't know what gene they were testing for. And the outcome of that, I think, is quite profound, because they're teasing you out in this. And this is the peak here, they said, that suggests actually that you have the gene variant that is not associated with a resilience gene. So he hasn't got it, even though he's resilient. So the narrator says, so how do you feel about this, Simon? I think his reply is quite profound. I don't know. I think I'm probably leaning towards being slightly happy about that, in the sense that it's the sort of nurture element rather than nature element. I always wanted it to be about who I am, not what I am. It's not what happens, it's what you're prepared to do about it that counts. It's his personality, not the presence or absence of a particular gene. So can I blame my genes? Well, they may affect our potential, but we still remain responsible for our actions. They may limit us, but they don't determine us. Even Richard Dawkins says that we are the only ones who can escape from our genes. And so we have doctors and social benefits and hospitals. We can tame and overthrow the tyranny of natural selection. In other words, what our genes determine that we should inevitably do. I rather like the quote too from Mark Twain in terms of that deterministic view. I'm different to Washington. I have a higher, grander standard of principle. Washington could not lie. I can lie, but I won't. What about belief in God? Is that genetically determined? Some people are rather gullible and they're open to spiritual persuasion, imagining things about religious belief that shouldn't be there. There's a book published back in, I think, 2002 by Dean Hamer called The God Gene, which made its way onto the front page of Time magazine. It is a study that was claimed in the book that has never been published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, never. And now we're 14 years on past this. He maintained that there were some neurotransmitter storage things that were a different variant of those who were spiritual. Something called self-transcendence, whatever that is, on the sort of psychometric scores that he was having. And claimed that there was a correlation with his VMAT2 gene and spirituality. It was a very small correlation, and it's very indeterminate as to what really this self-transcendence means. So Carl Zimmer, writing in Scientific American, puts it this way, rather pouring scorn on those studies. A gene that accounts for less than 1% of the variance found in scores of psychological questionnaires designed to measure a factor called self-transcendence, which can signify everything from belonging to the Green Party to believing in extrasensory perception, according to one unpublished, unreplicated study. So in other words, it's tosh. Just imagine it was true for a minute. You might like to, if you've got a few moments to spare, Google search something called FunVax. If it was true that there was a gene for spirituality, maybe we could immunise people against it. And you'll find a video clip of, I think it's a spoof FBI seminar over this, of saying, well, maybe the problem in the Middle East is that there's an overexpression of this gene, so what we should do is vaccinate people against it. So we'll put the vaccine into a flu vector, and we'll infect everybody out there with flu, and then they'll all get vaccinated against spirituality, and they'll all calm down and be sensible, won't they? Do look at that. It's great fun. It's quite convincing, but it is a total hoax. There is no such thing, and even if you wanted a vector for things, you'd never use the flu as a viral vector anyway. Says Francis Collins, I have evolved from being a committed atheist in my 20s to being a firm believer in my 50s. During my conversion, there is no evidence that my DNA changed. The notion that spirituality is hardwired cannot be entirely correct. Look a moment for some of the wonders of the DNA molecule itself. Could biology function in any other replicative molecule? Stephen Benner is a chemist. As far as I know, he has no religious belief at all. Writing in Nature a few years back, and he is a chemist who makes artificial forms of DNA. He calls himself an astrobiologist because he's looking for life on other planets chemically as well. So he said, in writing this some time ago, the first thing you realise is that it's a stupid design. You'd never choose to do that. And the reason he gives for it is schoolboy chemistry, is that you know that there's negative charges on that. Negative charges repel each other. They go to the opposite ends of the universe. So it's not going to stick together anyway. It's got things repelling itself. The base pairs on that, A and T and G and C, are held together by hydrogen bonds. And he says these are very weak and easily broken by water. You're trusting your valuable genetic inheritance to hydrogen bonds in water. If you were a chemist setting out to design this thing, you wouldn't do it this way. So is DNA the inevitable material? Well, we now know that you can change things of that chemically and see what effect it has on its properties. And since saying that, actually, Stephen Benner has retracted those sorts of statements and actually says that now he thinks that if we look for genetic material on any other planet, it's likely it will be very similar to our own DNA. It's such a remarkable molecule that you have to be able to separate those strands. Anything that's held together too tightly, of course you could never separate them. It is indeed a remarkable molecule that's able to be replicated. You can get mistakes in it that are still copied. It enables mutation and evolution. It is too, I think, a thing of beauty. I'm not one prone to artistic fancy, but look at some of these structures and just say how wonderful they are. Here is our maybe a familiar look at DNA, the right-handed helix drawn as a stick molecule rather than as balls. You may not have seen it look to this way. This is looking down the top of the DNA helix, staring down the spiral. And you see this beautiful sort of rosette-type structure across there. Some of the molecules, the way in which it's packaged in the cell. Right there are artificial colours within this, but these are intricate molecules. A very beautiful structure. Here's one of the proteins that binds to DNA, wrapped all the way around it. Here's our looking down the axis of DNA with this protein bound around the outside. There is a form of artistry and wonder even in just looking at that. But one of the questions we do have to face, as well as our own identity and what makes us human, is how we can, or should we, in any way interfere with that. And now that technologies have developed over the past even 3 or 4 years that enable us, in principle, to be able to modify the human genome. We've been modifying the genomes of bacteria and viruses and plants and animals for some time in the laboratory. They've been laborious and cumbersome experiments to do, but now as a result of 1 or 2 technologies, we're able to modify genomes, a form of cut and paste technology. Take the Huntington's disease gene out and replace it with the correct one. Take a cancer-forming gene out and replace it with the correct one. And these are some of the phrases you will hear in the media, particularly this CRISPR-Cas9 technology. It sounds, I know, like a cooking oil, but it does actually, it is serious science. And it's relatively straightforward to do. It can be done in almost any molecular biology laboratory, at least on simple organisms. Can we or should we do that with humans? You can do it on somatic cells, in other words, cells that are developed and have nothing to do with the germline. And here is a rather moving example of that with a girl, Lila Richards, who was suffering from a terminal form of leukemia. Her white cells were taken out and modified by a version of this technology, very complicated bits of molecular biology, and put back into her cell again, her body again, after removing the cancer-forming genes. And whereas she was effectively destined to die, as all the medics would put it, this was in the terminal phase, she is now in total remission. So that's an example of somatic cell mutation. There are other ones as well. It's possible to take T cells out of individuals and in theory modify them so that they are no longer susceptible to infection by HIV and put them back into people. So you could make people resistant to, say, the HIV virus. But that's somatic. That's not carried from one generation to the next. What about modifying germ cells or embryos? It raises big questions for us as Christians as to what can and what should we do. What is healing and what is tinkering? The genie was out the bottle in 2015 when a Chinese group did just that to early embryos. Admittedly, these are embryos that could never have been implanted. They had all sorts of other genetic abnormalities as well. So it was never done with the intention of creating a human out of this. But at least they showed the principle that it could be done. Why shouldn't it be done? Issues of risk. What's the effect of that, not just on that individual, but on future generations? Issues of autonomy. That individual would have had no choice over that particular form of therapy. It raises questions as to what is normal. I think the whole of you are abnormal. I'm a normal person in the room. What is normal? Is having black hair that goes grey in your early 30s, as mine did, is that normal? You raise all these sorts of questions. It raises a question about genetic classism. Are some people are superior to others on the basis of their genes? No, they're not. We're all unique as humans with different attributes. All should be equally valued. And we kind of have a commodification of life itself and says that it's a commodity that we should seek the best out of it rather than something that's there to be enjoyed as it is. So we might ask some questions at different levels. Would it be permissible to modify the genome of an embryo that otherwise would not be born, that suffered from a fatal genetic disease? Would it be possible to, or permissible, to modify the genome of an embryo that will, say, carry a disease such as cystic fibrosis? Would it be permissible to modify the genome of an embryo that will develop a condition later in life? Those with Huntington's disease live quite normal lives for maybe 30, perhaps 40 years, and then suffer from a debilitating, awful disease. I have a colleague who suffers from Huntington's disease. Would it be permissible to modify the genome so as to enhance our properties? Or to do something for cosmetic reasons, to choose blue eyes rather than brown eyes, to choose black hair rather than grey hair? And various scientists have suggested that we should put a halt on this, that we should explore the ethical dimensions of this first of all. Genome editing in embryos using current technologies could have unpredictable effects on future generations. This makes it dangerous and ethically unacceptable. But they're arguing largely on the basis of risk, not on the basis of right or wrong. It's a utilitarian kind of argument. And actually you need to ask too what can be achieved by it that can't be achieved by other methods. So here's Francis Collins again, who points out that most of the advances in that technology, at least in terms of embryos, could be achieved by other methods of in vitro fertilization and selection of the correct embryos. So what? But is it the slippery slope? to be able to modify genomes to enhance our physical attributes, whether we're athletic or not, to enhance, say, our musical attributes. I can't sing very well, you'd be pleased to know I don't intend to sing this. Our intelligence, our bold, all those sorts of things. Is this the slippery slope? And he also asks questions for those who do suffer from disabilities, at whatever level, and how much do we honour or prejudice against them. So Tom Shakespeare, known often on the media, talks about this isn't something that they care about so much. What they care about is removing prejudice that there is against some who are disabled. The voices of people living with illness and impairment need to be heard within this whole genetic debate. There's a possibility within our knowledge of DNA of being able to create artificial life. Craig Ventnor is supposed to, he has, taken the DNA out from a bacterium and put in totally synthetic DNA. It's not quite artificial life because the rest of the bacterial cell was still there and intact, and all its replicative machinery was still there. Is this life version 2.0? And he and George Church recently suggested, what about making an artificial human genome? We don't have the technology to do so yet, but never say never. The chemistry is moving at a fantastic pace. Could we actually make an artificial human genome? And if we did, what would it look like? It would look like mine, of course. Our DNA also tells us a little bit about what it is like to live on this planet Earth, and says a little bit about not just evolution and mutation, but our own vulnerability. There are serious risks to living on planet Earth. We know that fire warms, but it also burns. Water refreshes, but it also drowns. Mutations in DNA are essential for driving the evolutionary process, but they also cause cancer. Could God have made a world that was any other way? Reflects back to the first talk we had this morning, looking at Job and the questions that were being thrown up there. Could God have made a world in any other way than to put us in a vulnerable environment? One of the most damaging things for DNA actually is water. Try living in a non-aqueous environment. You can't. It damages, chemically reacts with the bases. Oxygen damages DNA itself. These are mutagens. We live in a vulnerable environment. Ultraviolet light damages our DNA, which is why you put the sunblock on and you don't stay on the UV beds for too long. And a large amount of our genomes is to do with repair and restoration. A Nobel Prize last year was given to 3 individuals who'd spent their lives looking at the repair apparatus. And it says that our genomes are self-repairing. Plenty of enzymes in there that are to do with restoration, to do with repair. And I think that says quite a number of things that are important for the Christian. Did you know that each one of your bodies has something like 10 to the 16 to 10 to the 18 damage events per day? That's how susceptible your genomes are to damage. And yet there are enzymes that are most of the time very efficiently at correcting those damages. So I hope in this talk I've been able to raise a lot of questions for you that we need to be able to address as Christians, to maybe debunk a little bit of the mystery that goes behind DNA, to ask a little bit about whether it really does control our destiny, to give you a sense of awe and wonder in that, and a sense also of our own vulnerability. I'll close just with 2 slides. One is taken from a hand-drawn card that one of my undergraduate students gave me as she graduated as a thank you. Quoting from Isaiah chapter 65. The Lord says, "Be glad and rejoice forever in what I create." And she's put a model of DNA in there. It's unfortunate she drew a left-handed helix on the right hand. But such is the nature of undergraduate students. Rejoice in what God has made. And finally, the words of the psalmist, the scientist's psalm, Psalm 111. Great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them. And I put various images of DNA around them. And a couple of other translations of that verse, or rather not translations, but at least modern versions of it. How wonderful are things the Lord does. All who delighted with them want to understand them, as it puts in the Good News Bible. Or the Message, and I don't very often quote from the Message. God's works are so great, worth a lifetime of study, endless enjoyment. Thank you.